can tell you is in those early days, it was not a fun thing. A lot of people died. I went to a lot of funerals. I remember going to a dinner party, would have been probably in the late 90s, probably early 2000s. But I just remember being at a dinner party with a bunch of gay guys, and we sat down after dinner and we're drinking coffee, and we just got into this big conversation about how we were able to get through all that, and there is this thing called survivor's guilt. I think that probably it's got a lot more to do with partners of people with HIV, but not necessarily. It's kind of like, wow, I went through this whole, HIV was 81 and it's 2021, so that's 40 something years, some people in the gay community are kind of like, how is it that we managed not to get it? And yet you've got plenty of friends that did. And well, certainly don't dwell on it, that's for one thing, but to reminisce about it and to think about how bad it was and to go through all that and then see how things have improved so much. I don't reminisce about what has happened in the past. It's kind of like, I kind of get pissed off about why are these young people getting infected.
Dr. Robert Brandt, Dayton, Ohio. Throughout this series, I've used clips from my interview with Dr. Brandt to frame the conversations we're having about HIV now against the backdrop of what the state of HIV was in its early years. Before he retired in 2018, Dr. Brandt was a physician in the Dayton area. He graduated from medical school in 1980, just a year before AIDS would grow to epidemic proportions in the US. As a gay man himself, he wanted to serve his fellow members of the LGBTQ+ community and did so throughout the height of the AIDS epidemic and onward. His story and the experiences he's had throughout his career have really resonated with me and continued to inspire me as I've worked on this series, as has every other conversation I've gotten to have with the amazing HIV researchers, advocates, and activists I've gotten to speak with. They've grounded me in my desire to continue to raise awareness about HIV and do my part to help educate other people about all the nuances that exist within that topic. They're my why, my motivation, as are all the other people who have lived and died fighting HIV, and all the people who still live with it today, even in times when it seems no one is paying attention. Today, for the final episode of the series, we're going to do things a little bit differently. For almost every one of my interviews, I asked people their why, what it was that drew them to HIV, and to want to make a difference in the lives of people affected by it. So that's what I'll be playing for you today. Some of those moments and those answers, to answer the question, why? Why is HIV still an important subject today? Why is HIV worth urgency and attention? Why is HIV in need of people like you listening to this podcast to continue the fight? My name is Nicholas Wood, and this is How to Invent a Virus. The first response I'd like to highlight was from my conversation with Dr. Judith Auerbach. Dr. Auerbach has been involved with HIV advocacy for around 30 years, helping medical researchers and policymakers understand where their interests can intersect to serve people in the best way possible. Here was her response to the question, why did you begin centering your work around HIV? Working in San Francisco, I'm sure it was a major part of the culture and public conversation there.
It was. I was in grad school when HIV emerged in the 80s, early 80s. And so for me, it was mostly in the news and in the community. As I say, it wasn't my own personal connection yet, but professional connection, just more as a citizen, concerned citizen.
Right. So, and then what has kept you involved with it for all these years?
Wow, great question, and I ask myself this all the time. It is a combination of things. One, This may be a little TMI, but it's relevant. I am a Jewish person. I was, raised Reform Jew, and I'm of a generation that was only like 10, 15 years out from World War II, and we grew up, and I also grew up in a progressive community, and our mantra was never again. We would always fight so that no other group or population would ever be subject to the kind of Holocaust that we were. And so I think I've had this strong ethic about, social justice and protecting people from tyranny and all that kind of stuff. And so there's a part of my commitment to HIV that is, this is sort of the plague. And, some people in the gay community in particular would have argued it was a bit of genocide early on when the politicians were not paying sufficient attention and people were stigmatizing who had HIV and how they acquired HIV. So for me, it was like, this is the genocide, so to speak, the plague of our time, and people are being affected in ways that, I grew up just believing shouldn't happen. So I sort of have this commitment to combating the pandemic, the epidemic, based on that ethic. That's part of it. It was directly affecting people I knew and loved and worked with. And I guess related to that, again, it's personal information, but I'm public about it. My youngest brother acquired HIV and died in 1991. And so it was after I had started working on HIV. He wasn't the reason I got involved, but in part I've stayed involved, in his honor and his memory, as well as those of others I've known and loved and lost. Mm-hmm. And then finally, I guess I'd say it's an absolutely compelling, I don't want to say cause, but it is sort of a cause, the struggle, the campaign against HIV. From all angles, social justice, political, and even intellectual. And so, whatever you may be interested in, whether it's health or education or the economy or politics, there's something connected to HIV. And so I think it's just a very compelling issue and cause and concern that has remained for decades. So I stay in it because I find it so compelling.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm sorry to hear about your youngest brother, and thank you for sharing that and being so personal.
I'll say to that the personal is professional sometimes, and we don't always fess up to these things. But, in this case, I think it's really important to do so.
Like Dr. Auerbach said, the personal is professional. In the first episode of this series, Dr. Auerbach made the point that HIV is a virus that can't just be treated as a lone pathogen. It operates and is transmitted over the course of human relationships. When you consider that over 1 million people are living with HIV in the US and over 37 million people are living with it worldwide, that's a lot of impacted human relationships. Millions of people are dealing with HIV, some for decades, and for them, the urgency and understanding of the virus, optimizing treatments, and moving towards a cure hasn't gone away, despite what little information may be present in mainstream media. And on the subject of the media, the next person whose why I'd like to call back to, and on the subject of the media, I'd like to call back to my interview with Tina Hoff. Tina is the Senior Vice President at the Kaiser Family Foundation and the Executive Director of their Social Media Impact Program. Tina has won 8 Emmy Awards, a Peabody Award, and a National TV of Arts and Sciences Governor's Award for her work in developing pro-social HIV campaigns with MTV, CBS, Fox, Viacom, and BET, among others. Her continuous effort to educate people about HIV through the media has helped make a global impact, and in the second episode of this series, she emphasizes that in order to create effective messaging, it has to be about more than facts, but also human connection. Because again, HIV is not something that affects everyone in the same way. Any given person could have a different perspective on the issue than the other, and that's why it's so important for the media and the information put out about HIV to be a resource that unites us all in a common understanding. And to do that, uplifting the voices of those impacted by HIV, letting them tell their stories is what provides so much more insight into the state of the virus today than facts and figures alone. But still, the media is where the conversation starts, not ends. It's a catalyst to inspire action within your community, which brings us to Sabrina Cluesman. Sabrina is a PhD student at New York University's Silver School of Social Work. Before studying in New York University, however, they served the Jacksonville, Florida LGBTQ community through their work with the Jacksonville Area Sexual Minority Youth Network, or Jasmine. Sabrina helped queer youth newly diagnosed with HIV navigate the healthcare system while simultaneously trying to help repair that system herself. And here is her reason for stepping up and being that source of support for so many people.
So someone that I'm close to was diagnosed in the early 90s, and it was terrifying, and no one really knew, we didn't really know much. I lived in the South, and that, really was, I think, a big push for me. So when I moved to Seattle, and then when I started college in my mid-20s, I went to school in Seattle at Seattle Central Community College, was where I first started school 20 years ago. And I took all my opportunities to do research to focus on HIV, initially to understand it and to understand how it happened to this person that I love and care about. And if there was anything I could do about it. And, so it really kind of just started, all of my research opportunities throughout all of undergrad were really focused on HIV and how it impacted young people and around education and lack thereof. And that sort of propelled me to when I moved back to Florida, where I had lived before I went to Seattle, and I finished my undergrad at the University of North Florida. But then I found out about this LGBT youth center called Jasmine. And I took the opportunity. I had to volunteer 20 hours for this class. And so I reached out. I had a mutual friend, and I reached out and asked if I might be able to volunteer. I got set up to volunteer, and that was in 2005. And then I basically stayed there until 2019 when I came to New York. The long story short is, through all of that, I was trained in 10 different evidence-based interventions from the CDC, and throughout all of it, I felt still I was eventually, it started to feel like I was just kind of hitting the same barriers. And those barriers were structural around funding and research and things that I felt why I decided to get a PhD was I wanted to affect change on a more structural level and be able to take my clinical experiences and my work, working directly with people living with HIV and those at high risk for HIV. And the unique kind of knowledge I have from those experiences and apply it in a research setting.
Breaking down barriers to care and changing the landscape. Generally speaking, the United States healthcare system is incredibly flawed and does not serve all populations equally, as we briefly outlined in episode 3. And for the purposes of our conversation on HIV, this makes things incredibly complicated. For those at-risk individuals who can't necessarily rely on the healthcare system for assistance, their best bet is taking action through preventative measures like condom use, using clean needles and syringes when engaging in injection drug use, and PrEP. But for those who are living with HIV and trying to navigate how their treatment regimen can fit into their lifestyle, there can be a big learning curve. That's where people like Dr. Parya Saberi come into play. People who take into account the various challenges and lifestyles that can interfere with someone's adherence to HIV treatment and PrEP use, and try to construct new ways to assist them and keep them healthy. Dr. Saberi has helped lots of young people living with HIV in this way through the research she has conducted in the Department of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco's Division of Prevention Science. Here she is to discuss her motivation for getting involved in this area of work. What was your initial motivation to get involved with HIV research?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I feel like I have these I have several answers, and it's one of those things where you're how far back do you dig to find the truth? But so I'm originally from Iran, and I'm product of a revolution, and one thing that was very much hammered in our head to a brainwash level is this need for global health, not just public health, global health, and essentially this idea of equity. And it was almost this sort of imperative to have kind of like soldiers, if you will, of like healthcare soldiers to provide that equity. And so I very much see myself as part of that, like that will of trying to provide some health equity, in a global setting. But there's, in a weird way, upholding this almost familial legacy of people that I don't know, but who did so much advocacy and so much work, which I think extends well beyond HIV, as we've seen within the current pandemic, but applied to so many other public health arenas. So I see that as almost like a human legacy. Like it's a legacy for all of us that we need to uphold. And I think honestly, there's a part of me where I feel like that's why I'm also drawn to doing research, particularly with youth and young adults, is that I see that energy and that devotion within the current younger generation is really like trying to undo a lot of wrongdoings of the past and really trying to be those health warriors or the advocates for future generations. So I really do appreciate that like stubbornness of like we need to find a cure. We need to find an end, or start to talk about the end and not just turn a blind eye to a problem.
In a similar way to Dr. Saberi, the idea of legacy is something that I've always clung to throughout the creation of this podcast. When HIV and AIDS first began popping up in the LGBT community and injection drug users and racial minorities, it was easy for people to turn the other cheek. These were groups that had historically been othered, ostracized, and many people saw AIDS as a punishment for those groups. So it took the work of ordinary people to stand up and do something when no one else would. People who dedicated their lives and, in a lot of cases, died trying to carry us to the end of this virus. People who deserve to have others pick up where they left off and continue to fight, continue to be that voice, that advocate for themselves, for their communities, and for our future. And we all have the power to do that. Whether it's through volunteering at your local LGBT center or HIV clinic, sharing information with the people around you through social media, making an educational podcast, or any other means you have available to you, big or small. We've got a long way to go, and you never know how far a little compassion can go. The final response I'd like to play for you today comes from Dr. Robin Pollini. Dr. Pollini is an epidemiologist working in West Virginia, studying populations of people who inject drugs and the barriers they face when it comes to preventing the spread of HIV and adhering to an HIV treatment regimen in rural communities. I want to know, you mentioned you've been in this for 20 years. What initially got you, motivated you to start working in this area?
It was kind of circuitous, but a lot of people get into this because there are people who use drugs or they've known people who use drugs. That was not my path. There is a ban on the use of federal funds to purchase syringes, although it's been pulled back a little bit. And I was taking an HIV course in the 90s, like a night class, and I wrote my paper on needle exchange programs, which is what they used to be called. And Bill Clinton was about to repeal the ban on federal funding for syringes. And everyone knew this was going to happen and whatever. And at the last minute, he decided not to. And I was just floored because I had spent the whole semester, reading all this research about how effective they are. And, this is like 30 years ago, 25 years ago. How could he do this? And my background is in policy. So I've always been sort of fascinated by that place where science and policy don't match. So where science tells you should do something to improve health and the policy doesn't match that. But I also think I'm just fueled by this, like a sort of social justice, or I just have this righteous indignation that we have the information we need to keep people healthy and we don't do it. I mean, that's just antithetical to everything I understand it is to be a human being. Why would we keep services away from people that we know can save their lives? It's just never made sense to me. I think about that a lot, about empathy. I did a paper with one of my research assistants on this, but like cultivating empathy. Why am I empathetic and other people are not, right? How do we
cultivate empathy towards people that are different than us. Like, I am not a person who uses drugs, but if I can care about these folks, why can't other people who don't do drugs? Like, I don't have a horse in this race, you know?
To close out this episode in this series, I'd like to read an excerpt from Vito Russo's 1988 speech, Why We Fight. Vito was an LGBTQ rights activist, film historian, and author. Throughout the 1980s, he fought for AIDS research and advocacy up until he lost his life to the virus in 1990. Why We Fight is a seminal speech he gave at an ACT UP demonstration in Albany, New York, and something that I found myself returning to throughout the creation of this series to help me reassert my why. Someday the AIDS crisis will be over. Remember that. And when that day comes, when that day has come and gone, there will be people alive on this earth, gay people and straight people, men and women, black and white, who will hear the story that once there was a terrible disease in this country and all over the world, and that a brave group of people stood up and fought, and in some cases gave their lives so that other people might live and be free. Once again, I'm Nick Wood, and thank you for listening to How to Invent a Virus. I'd like to give one last thank you to Dr. Robert Brandt, Dr. Judith Auerbach, Sabrina Cluesman, Dr. Parya Saberi, and Robin Pollini for speaking with me in this episode, as well as everyone else who spoke with me for this project, shared their perspective, and helped me learn so much. Thank you to Dr. Marie Thompson, again, for her advisory support in the creation of this podcast. And finally, thank you, all of you, for listening. For more information on HIV resources in your communities, such as testing, treatment services, and prevention options, click the link tree in the description of this episode. Thanks.